This video was brought to you by our show, The Daily Briefing. In the last couple of days, the Russian front line in the north of Kherson has continued to collapse. Russian forces are continuing their retreat along the Dnipro River towards Kherson city. But the fact that there are no viable crossings over the Dnipro, apart from the Novokakhovka Dam, means that the Russians on the west side of the river are at serious risk of encirclement. If the Ukrainians pull this off, we could be looking at the largest mass surrender of the war so far. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the most recent developments, why things really don't look good for Russian forces in the area, and what this all means for the wider trajectory of the war. This story in Ukraine, the maps and the fighting, has been moving so fast lately that we've had to make a number of videos about it just in the last couple of weeks. So if you want more going forward, be sure to subscribe, because at the moment, a lot of you are at risk of missing out. Anyway, it really helps us out. As we explained in our last video, in the last few months, the largest Ukrainian gains have come in the north and the east, around the Kharkiv Oblast and Donbass. There was obviously the rapid Ukrainian counter-offensive last month, but since then, Ukrainian forces have continued to make steady progress eastwards, moving along the Seversky Donets River towards Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, two towns on either side of the Seversky Donets, with a combined pre-war population of about 200,000 that Russian forces captured way back in early July. However, in the past couple of days, the focus of the Ukrainian attack has shifted southwards, and Ukrainian forces in the Kherson Oblast have made rapid progress after the Russian front line apparently collapsed. To understand what's happened, you need to know a bit about the area first. For the past few months or so, the front line in Kherson, which goes from Zelenodolsk all the way down to the Black Sea coast, has run parallel to the Dnipro River, roughly 20 kilometers deep. In the northern part of this front line, the Zelenodolsk down to Snihurivka, the front line essentially ran along the Inhulets River, a smaller river which then runs from Snihurivka down to the northern suburbs of Kherson city. While the Inhulets is less than 100 meters wide for most of its length, it still provided a difficult challenge for Ukrainian forces. Nonetheless, in early September, while most of the media was focused on Ukraine's rapid advancement in Kharkiv, Ukrainian forces successfully established a bridgehead over the Inhulets at Bilohirka and have since advanced south towards Chekhlove. While finding a foothold on the east side of the Inhulets was a significant achievement, the Russians were, for the most part, able to contain the Ukrainian advance in the area because it was effectively isolated and reliant on a single supply line. That was, at least, until Sunday, when Russian forces in the northernmost part of the front lines apparently collapsed. After months of continuous pressure from the Ukrainian army, Russian forces around Zelenodolsk started crumbling, and the Ukrainians staged a rapid advance, moving south from Zelenodolsk down to the Inhulets River and chasing the Russians along its banks. At the same time, those Ukrainian forces that we mentioned a second ago, who crossed the Inhulets River in Bilohirka, moved southeast, essentially surrounding the Russians and forcing a hasty retreat. Russian forces tried to regroup at Dudcheny, but were forced to retreat even further along the river and instead set up a new defensive lines at Milove, roughly 16 kilometers downstream. All in all, this means that the Ukrainians have captured something like 1,000 square kilometers worth of territory over the past 5 days. While that's less than a quarter of the amount of territory captured in Kharkiv, it's still an enormous win, especially given that A, the advance is still continuing, and B, Russians have a far higher troop density in Kherson than Kharkiv. So what happens next? Well, if the Ukrainians continuing to press the Russians, they'll be in real trouble. There are only two large crossings over the Dnipro available to Russians. The Novokakhovka Dam, which lies just 35 kilometers southwest of Milove, and the Antonovsky Bridge, which lies on the outskirts of Kherson. Unfortunately for the Russians, both the Novokakhovka Dam and the Antonovsky Bridge have been under near continuous shelling from the Ukrainians since they received HIMARS missile systems, and neither are really functioning. The Russians have tried to repair them and set up parallel pontoon bridges, but both crossings only have very limited capacity. The point here is that Russians don't have any clear way over the Dnipro River, which means they can't really retreat en masse. If the Ukrainians continue to make progress at the rate they have recently, the 25,000 or so Russian troops on the west side of the Dnipro could well be forced into a massive surrender. This is something that Russian soldiers have apparently been complaining about on Russian Telegram channels. They know that they don't have a way out if the Ukrainians continue their advance, and they know that their command doesn't have a contingency plan either. If this were to continue to happen, it would truly be catastrophic for Russian morale, which is already at a low ebb after the events in the north around Kharkiv. So you get the idea. The Russians are suffering yet another collapse on the battlefield, this time in Kherson. This is particularly embarrassing for Putin, not just because, well, his army is in retreat, but also because less than a week ago he claimed that Kherson had become part of Russia. So what might he do in response? Well, as we mentioned in Tuesday's video, there are two obvious options. Accelerate the partial mobilization or some sort of non-conventional escalation. Let's start with option 1, accelerate the partial mobilization. This would essentially involve sending conscripts to the front line without sufficient training. This would be difficult for Putin for two reasons. First, it would almost definitely mean more casualties, which would be politically difficult. Second, it's becoming increasingly clear that mobilization isn't going to plan. Forbes is reporting that 700,000 Russians have fled the country to avoid mobilization, and there have been multiple reports of shortages, poor training conditions, and even mutinies amongst new conscripts. While the mobilization will still probably provide the Russians with a few 100,000 more men in the medium term, it's just not clear that they have the administration capacity to accelerate it effectively. This leaves option 2, some sort of non-conventional escalation. The most obvious move here is a tactical nuclear weapon, but it could also mean something like cutting Europe's undersea interconnectors. Obviously, neither of these are good options for Putin. It's not clear how much of an advantage they'll actually afford him, and any further escalation would almost certainly provoke a reaction, not just from the pro-Ukrainian West, but the international community more widely. But it's just not like he's got that many better options available. There's clearly a lot happening in Ukraine at the moment, but that's not all that's happening around the world. In fact, this weekend there was a major election in Brazil, as well as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria and Latvia. We don't have time to cover them all in separate videos, but we did put together an election special over on the Daily Briefing. So if you want to catch up on what happened, then the link to that is in the description. You should subscribe to that channel too, because while we don't always do election specials every day, we do update you on the biggest news stories and ensure you never miss anything from around the world. Or listen through your favourite podcast app and never feel left behind by the news cycle again.